Hello, my name is Amelia, and I'm 22 years old. You're probably wondering how a young woman like me ended up living with her uncle. It sounds strange, doesn't it? I never imagined something like this could happen, especially not in the way it did. But sometimes life has a way of taking us places we least expect. What's to come next will probably shock you as much as it did me. So, let's go back to where it all started. Art has always been my world, a space where I could express myself without fear of judgment. I'm a graphic designer, and from the moment I picked up my first pencil, I knew this was what I was meant to do. There's something about creating something from nothing, about breathing life into a blank canvas, that fills me with a sense of purpose. My designs are more than just images on a screen. They're pieces of my soul, little fragments of my thoughts and dreams. But my personal life? Well, it's been far from simple. My parents separated when I was just 5. I was too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships, but I was old enough to feel the sting of their separation. The endless arguments, the cold silences. The days when I would hear them shouting in the other room, and then suddenly, everything would go quiet. I never knew who I should turn to, who I could trust, or even where I could call home. After the divorce, we moved from place to place, never staying long enough to make any real memories. My mother tried her best to hold everything together, but I could see the toll it took on her. The late nights spent working 2 jobs, the worry in her eyes as she tried to make ends meet. And my father, well, he was a distant figure, always preoccupied with his own life. I don't think he ever fully understood what it was like for me. He never really knew how to be there. As I grew older, the feeling of not belonging to being a leaf floating in a stream, carried wherever the current took me, only intensified. I often wondered if I would ever find a place that felt like home, a place where I could finally put down roots. It was during my second year of college that I found myself at a crossroads. My mother had taken a new job out of state, and I was left to figure out what to do next. That's when my Uncle Daniel stepped in. He was my mother's older brother, and although we had never been particularly close, he offered me a place to stay while I finished my studies. His house, tucked away in the countryside on the outskirts of the city, seemed like the perfect escape from the chaos of my life. It was quiet, serene, the complete opposite of everything I'd known. I moved in with him without much thought. I told myself it would be temporary, just a few months, until I could find my footing. The house itself was a charming, weathered building with ivy creeping up its stone walls and a sprawling garden that stretched into the horizon. It was a place of peace, a place where I could focus on my studies without the distractions of city life. Uncle Daniel was kind but distant. He was a man of few words, a quiet, reserved soul who had spent most of his life working in the city before retiring to the countryside. He didn't ask too many questions about my past, and I didn't offer many answers. We kept to ourselves for the most part. I focused on my studies, and he busied himself with his gardening and the occasional trip to town. At first, the calmness of the place was exactly what I needed. The soft rustling of the trees in the breeze, the chirping of birds in the morning, the distant hum of nature. It was all so different from the noise of the city. I thought I could finally find peace here, that I could heal the wounds I had carried with me for so long. I even began to feel like I was discovering parts of myself I never knew existed. The quiet gave me the space to think, to reflect. But as it often happens, life had other plans. It started slowly, at first a subtle change in the air. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something felt different. The house felt different. It was as if the walls were holding secrets, whispers in the shadows that I couldn't quite understand. I began to notice small things that I couldn't explain. A door that would creak open in the middle of the night, even though I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. The flicker of lights when no one was near them. The sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. The stress of college, the isolation of living in such a quiet place, it was all getting to me. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense the feelings became. One night, I was working late in my room, my computer screen the only light in the otherwise dark house. The silence around me was deafening. The kind of silence that makes you acutely aware of every small sound, the tapping of my fingers on the keyboard, the rustle of paper, the occasional breath I took. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, just at the edge of my hearing, like someone was calling my name. I froze. My heart raced. I looked around my room, my eyes scanning the corners of the room as if something or someone might be hiding there. But there was nothing. No one. I told myself it was just the wind, the house settling, my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next few days were a blur of strange occurrences. The whispers continued, always when I was alone, always when the house was at its quietest. I began to feel like I wasn't the only one there, like there was someone or something else sharing the space with me. And the more I tried to push it away, the more real it became. Uncle Daniel, of course, noticed that something was off. He would occasionally look at me with a concerned expression, asking if I was all right, but I always brushed him off. I didn't want to seem crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond my vision, something I couldn't quite understand. And that's when I realized life in this house wasn't as peaceful as I thought it would be. There were things hidden in the shadows, things that even Uncle Daniel wasn't willing to confront. And as the days passed, the atmosphere in the house became heavier, more suffocating, until it felt like the very air itself was thick with secrets. Now, I know you're probably wondering what happened next. I haven't even scratched the surface of what's to come. But trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Make sure you're subscribed, and if you're enjoying the story so far, leave a thumbs up. Things are about to get a whole lot more intense. The truth about this house, about my uncle, about everything I thought I knew, it's all about to unravel. And when it does, you'll wish you'd never set foot here. When my mother had to leave town for work, I found myself with an unexpected burden. I was still in the middle of finishing my degree, and my living situation had become complicated. My only option, it seemed, was to reach out to my Uncle Daniel. He had always been an important figure in my life, someone who I could count on during difficult times. Though I hadn't seen him much in recent years, his place in my heart remained significant. Daniel and his wife Eleanor had been married for several years by then, and they lived in a large, beautiful house on the outskirts of town, far removed from the noise and chaos of city life. It was a sanctuary of sorts, a quiet, peaceful place where the world seemed to slow down. The perfect environment, I thought, for me to focus on my studies. At the time, it seemed like an ideal arrangement. A roof over my head, a safe place to stay, and a calm atmosphere to immerse myself in my work. I couldn't have known that this temporary solution would soon spiral into something I wasn't prepared for. When I first arrived, it was hard to shake the unease I felt. Everything in the house felt foreign. The walls, painted in muted tones, the polished floors, the quiet hum of the air conditioning, it all seemed a little too perfect, a little too still. I wasn't used to being away from home for so long, let alone staying with family members I hadn't shared space with in years. Still, I told myself this was just a temporary arrangement. I was here to finish my degree and would move on as soon as I could. Eleanor, always warm and welcoming, was eager to make me feel comfortable. She wasn't the type to force conversation, but she always seemed to know just what I needed. When I arrived, she immediately set to work preparing meals and showing me around the house. Her quiet, calm nature was soothing, but there was a reserved quality about her, something that prevented me from ever truly feeling like I was part of the family. We exchanged pleasantries, and she tried her best to make me feel welcome, but the gap between us, both emotional and familial, remained. In those first few weeks, I stayed mostly to myself. I buried my head in my books, trying to push through the awkwardness that lingered in the corners of the house. There were moments, however, when I couldn't ignore the subtle rhythm of life in the house. The familiar clink of silverware during dinner, the quiet chatter between Daniel and Eleanor as they sat together on the porch after dinner. It felt like they had built a world of their own, one that I had just stepped into. It was easy to forget, in those moments, that I was only passing through. As the months passed, though, I started to settle in. My initial discomfort began to fade as I grew accustomed to their routines. I had a small corner of the house where I set up my study space, and I often found myself working there for hours on end. In those moments of quiet, I began to notice Eleanor's little acts of kindness. She'd offer tips on cooking, give me advice on household chores, and in a way, she seemed to take me under her wing, as though I were one of her own. The silence between us grew less pronounced, though we were never particularly close. Still, I thought I had made peace with the situation. The tension I had felt when I first arrived seemed to have melted away. Life had fallen into a steady rhythm, and I began to feel like I belonged. But that sense of calm would soon be shattered. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. I couldn't exactly pinpoint the moment it changed, but I began to feel different. I began noticing little things that I hadn't before, how Daniel looked at me sometimes, his gaze lingering a moment longer than usual. It wasn't overt, not in the way you might expect, but there was something in his eyes. Something softer, warmer. His smiles, once simply polite, seemed to hold a certain weight, a depth that made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't explain. At first, I brushed it off. I convinced myself that it was just my imagination. After all, Daniel was my uncle. He was family. He had been a constant in my life, someone I could trust, someone who had always looked out for me. But then the subtle touches started. A hand placed on my shoulder a bit too long, a casual brush of the arm that lingered just a moment longer than necessary. At first, they seemed innocent enough, harmless gestures, nothing more. But the longer I stayed, the more they began to feel charged, as though there was an unspoken connection between us that neither of us had acknowledged, but both of us felt. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that these were just normal familial gestures. Maybe I was just being overly sensitive. But it became harder and harder to ignore the growing tension between us. I would catch him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his gaze intense, but quickly shifting away when I met his eyes. It was almost as if he was afraid I might notice something that neither of us were ready to confront. The more time I spent with Daniel, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the looks or the touches. It was the way he seemed to hover near me, always offering to help, always around when I needed something. He was present in ways that felt too intimate for an uncle. The boundaries that had once been so clear, those invisible lines that separated us as family, began to blur, and I was left confused, unsettled, and unsure of how to handle it. I didn't want to acknowledge what was happening because it didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. But as the days passed, the tension only grew. I tried to bury myself in my studies, hoping that if I focused hard enough, I could forget the strange, shifting dynamic that had settled between us. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to consume me. It was like an invisible force was pulling us closer, and the harder I resisted, the more powerful it became. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling was undeniable. There was something unspoken between us, something neither of us wanted to acknowledge, but both of us knew was there. And no matter how much I tried to push it away, it lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was a quiet evening, one that promised to be like any other. The house, usually filled with the sounds of laughter and chatter, was unusually still. The only noise that filled the air was the soft rustling of the pages in my notebook as I worked on a design project. My mind, lost in a world of lines and colors, couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace that evening. The familiar hum of the house's old floorboards seemed to settle into a gentle lullaby as the night deepened. Daniel, my younger brother, had already fallen asleep hours ago, his deep breaths echoing faintly from his room down the hall. Eleanor, as always, was out with friends, her laughter and joy filling the empty spaces of the house before she disappeared out the door. I was left alone in the silence I thought I had grown accustomed to. But tonight, something felt different. The stillness seemed too heavy, too quiet. As I bent over my work, I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Soft, almost imperceptible, but there. My heart skipped a beat. Was it Eleanor returning early? No, she wasn't due back yet. And Daniel, he had already fallen asleep. I waited, uncertain of whether I should ignore it or investigate. And then, as if a quiet urge had stirred deep inside me, I found myself standing up. My feet carried me across the room without thought, as if my body knew something my mind couldn't grasp. The sound of footsteps grew louder as I approached the door to Daniel's room, and I felt an inexplicable pull of a magnetic force that made my hand reach for the door handle. I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking softly, but I couldn't bring myself to care. There, in the dim light of the hallway, I saw him. Daniel lay on his bed, his eyes closed, his arm resting behind his head in the most relaxed pose. The soft glow of the moonlight illuminated his face, casting a silver sheen over his features. His dark hair fell across his forehead like a messy halo, and for a moment, I felt as though I was looking at someone who belonged in a dream. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart thundering in my chest. A warmth rushed to my cheeks, and my breath became shallow. It was as if the world had shifted, and in that moment, everything felt charged. I wanted to step back, to leave and pretend I hadn't seen him like this, but something inside me, some deep, unexplainable force kept me rooted in place. I couldn't tear my gaze away. I must have stood there for a while, caught between a rush of emotions I couldn't fully understand. And then, as if fate had intervened, the vase on the shelf behind him tipped over. The crash of ceramic against the wooden floor shattered the moment, and Daniel stirred, his eyes blinking open in confusion. "Amelia?" His voice was thick with sleep, laced with the grogginess of someone just waking up. His eyes searched the dimly lit room, landing on me with a slow recognition. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice still hoarse from sleep. The moment his eyes met mine, the world seemed to pause. A silence fell between us, fragile and intense. My heart, which had been pounding against my chest like a drum, seemed to skip a beat. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stand there, feeling as though every inch of me was caught in some unknown current. I didn't mean to wake you," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. My throat had gone dry, and my pulse raced faster with each passing second. "I'm sorry." He rubbed his eyes, still half asleep, and smiled at me with that warm, reassuring smile I had seen 1,000 times before. But this time, something was different. Something shifted in the air between us. I could see it in his eyes, that familiar spark, but this time, it was brighter, more intense. Something about the way he looked at me made my heart skip a beat. "It's all right," he said, his voice soft, almost tender. "You know you can always talk to me, Amelia. I'm always here for you." His words should have reassured me. They should have made me feel comfortable. But instead, they made the tension in the room palpable, as if the very air between us had thickened. Without thinking, I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it myself. I felt a heat spreading across my body, my thoughts turning into a tangled mess. The room, which had felt vast and distant before, now seemed to shrink around us, closing in on the space we shared. And then he did something that made my heart stop. He patted the spot next to him on the bed. "Come here." "I'm here if you need to talk," he said gently, his voice low, almost coaxing.
For a moment, I hesitated.
Should I go? Should I stay? I couldn't understand what was happening, but something inside me, something I couldn't ignore, pulled me closer to him. Before I could fully think through my actions, my body moved on its own. I found myself sitting next to him on the bed, so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, mingling with mine. My pulse quickened, and I became acutely aware of every breath we both took. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, but there was something oddly comforting in it. His gaze never left me, steady and unwavering. I felt the weight of his stare, and it made the room feel smaller, more intimate. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, a constant reminder of how out of control I felt in this moment. "Are you all right?" he asked again, his voice a whisper now, as if he didn't want to disturb the fragile atmosphere between us. Before I could answer, I found myself moving closer to him, my lips brushing his, barely an accident, but enough to ignite something deep within me. The spark that had been flickering in the air between us flared to life in an instant. His lips were soft, warmer than I had expected, and in that brief, stolen moment, I forgot everything. I forgot the world outside. I forgot the confusion and the fear and the uncertainty that had been swirling inside me for days. All I could focus on was the feeling of him, of us, together in that quiet room. My body responded before my mind could catch up. Nathan's hand gently cupped my cheek, his touch sending a shiver down my spine. It felt so right, even though every rational thought in my head screamed at me to stop, to pull back. But I couldn't. Our kiss deepened, and everything the past, the present, and the future seemed to vanish in that one stolen moment. It wasn't just a kiss. It was an explosion of everything I had been holding back. The emotions I had buried deep within myself, the longing I had tried to ignore, the uncertainty that had clouded my thoughts, it all came crashing to the surface. At that moment, there was no turning back. The lines had blurred, the boundaries had disappeared, and all that remained was the undeniable pull between us. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to feel. Fully.
Completely.
The sound of the front door opening downstairs came like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile tension that had settled between Daniel and me. My heart slammed against my chest, a heavy, erratic rhythm that sent waves of panic through my body. The spell, whatever it was broken in an instant. The moment, so intense and so fleeting, dissolved like mist in the early morning sun. I pulled away from him, my breath shallow, my chest heaving with a mix of guilt, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name. What had we just done? The question gnawed at me like a persistent ache, but I couldn't quite bring myself to voice it. I felt exposed, raw, vulnerable, and terrified of what would come next. The footsteps on the stairs were soft, almost hesitant, but the sound of each step seemed to echo in the stillness of the room, amplifying my fear. I turned to Daniel, seeking something of an explanation, maybe, or a sign that everything would be okay. But his expression mirrored my own, a mix of confusion and regret, the kind of look that only comes when you've crossed a line you never meant to approach, let alone step over. The door to his room creaked open with a groan, and there she was, Eleanor. Her face was pale, drained of color, as though the weight of the moment had already taken its toll on her. Her sharp, perceptive eyes scanned the room. But she didn't need to see anything to know what had transpired. It was written all over our faces, and she knew it, even if she didn't say it out loud. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice trembling, thin like a thread about to snap. But beneath the tremor, there was something else, something deeper, more knowing. A quiet understanding that I couldn't escape. A truth, perhaps, that she had known all along, even before we did. I couldn't answer her. I couldn't even look at her. My mind was racing, spiraling, and I could feel the weight of the guilt sinking deeper with every passing second. It was as though the walls were closing in around me, and I couldn't breathe. Eleanor stepped into the room, the distance between us shrinking with every step she took. Her gaze flickered between Daniel and me, and it was clear that she wasn't angry. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't throwing accusations at us, which, for some reason, felt like the most terrifying part. It was the sadness in her eyes, the depth of it, that made my stomach churn. "I know what's happened," she said, her voice soft, almost gentle, in a way I didn't expect. Her words weren't filled with the sharp edge of betrayal, but instead, there was something tender there. Something that made the guilt feel even heavier than it already was. "But there's more to this than you realize. More than either of you can understand right now." Her words hung in the air like an unseen fog, suffocating and inescapable. The implications of them were far-reaching, and though I didn't want to admit it, I knew she was right. There was something beneath the surface, something that none of us were fully prepared to confront. Eleanor didn't leave. She stood there, her presence both comforting and unsettling. I could feel her eyes on me, on Daniel, and I felt like we were being dissected without a word spoken. She was offering us space, but also holding us accountable for the weight of our actions, Actions that, despite their fleeting nature, had already begun to change everything. "I'll give you both time," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it carried the weight of finality. "But you need to confront what's happening. All of it." And with that, she turned, her footsteps soft against the floor as she left the room, leaving us behind with our tangled emotions and the overwhelming weight of the truth she had just revealed. We were left there, suspended in an unbearable uncertainty. Amelia, Nathan, Eleanor, our lives, our relationships, all of it now caught in a web of desire, guilt, and things unsaid. None of us were innocent in this tangled mess, but I didn't know how to untangle it. Where did it even begin? The path ahead was no longer clear. There were no more easy choices, no simple answers. What had happened between Daniel and me felt like a turning point, a moment that would forever haunt us. But Eleanor's words still echoed in my mind, lingering like a distant warning. There was more to this, more to our pasts, to our secrets, to the lies we told ourselves. And no matter how hard we tried to pretend otherwise, we were all going to have to face it sooner or later. The room felt colder, quieter, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. I could feel the space between Daniel and me stretching, growing larger with each passing second. We weren't the same people we were before. We couldn't be. Whatever bond we had shared, whatever understanding existed between us, had been irrevocably changed. I wanted to reach out, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. They were tangled in my throat, too heavy, too full of things that were never meant to be spoken. Daniel, too, seemed lost in his thoughts, his eyes distant, clouded with guilt and confusion. I wanted to believe that things could go back to normal, that somehow we could fix this. But deep down, I knew better. Nothing would ever be the same again. And the most terrifying part of it all, neither of us knew what to do next. The silence stretched between us, suffocating and thick, until finally I whispered, barely audible, "What now?" Daniel didn't respond right away, and when he did, his voice was raw, edged with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "I don't know." And neither did I. The future was uncertain. The consequences of our actions still unknown. But one thing was clear. The unspoken truths had been set free, and there was no going back.